Imagine a world where the entire American financial system, the vast, roaring engine of the young republic, is about to collapse. Not from a war, but from a whisper. Banks are failing, fortunes are vanishing by the hour, and the United States has no central bank, no safety net, no plan. Then into this economic maelstrom steps a single granite-willed man, J.P. Morgan. A man with a godlike beard, eyes that could wither the strongest banker, and a power so immense that on a single terrifying night in 1907, he locked the most powerful financial titans in the country inside his magnificent library and told them they couldn't leave until they had personally saved the nation's economy. This is the astonishing, true, and high-stakes epic of how one private citizen, armed only with his ruthless intelligence and his checkbook, saved the United States from total financial ruin, forever changing the course of American capitalism. Part 1. The Whisper of Ruin. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm in the Gilded Age. The calendar flipped to October 1907. In New York City, the heart of the Gilded Age beat with a furious, almost decadent rhythm. Fifth Avenue gleamed with the new electric light. The mansions of the Vanderbilts and Astors stood as monuments to unimaginable wealth, and the air was charged with a limitless American optimism. Below the surface, however, the structure of prosperity was a brittle lattice ready to snap. For decades, the United States had operated without a true central bank, a conscious choice by a fiercely independent people suspicious of centralized power. The nation's currency was backed by gold, but its liquidity, the actual cash flow, was governed by a Byzantine system of small, scattered trust companies, commercial banks, and an utterly unregulated stock market. The entire mechanism was prone to violent, self-fulfilling panics. The tremor began not on Wall Street, but a few blocks north, with a man named F. Augustus Hines, a former copper baron from Montana, whose ambition was only outmatched by his recklessness. Hines, along with his brother Otto, cooked up a brazen scheme to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. It was a classic squeeze: buy up all the available shares, then demand an exorbitant price from the short sellers who were betting the stock would drop. On Monday, October 14th, the scheme was put into motion. For a frantic day, the Hineses seemed poised for victory. The copper price skyrocketed, but the market, like a living creature, fought back. Powerful counterforces were brought to bear by the established Wall Street houses, who saw the Hineses as disruptive upstarts. By Tuesday, the corner had failed catastrophically. The stock of United Copper plummeted from $60 to $10 in a single afternoon. Otto Hines was ruined. The collapse of the Hines brothers' gambit was not the main problem. It was the chilling fallout. The Hines brothers were directly linked to the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the city's largest and most prominent trust firms. A collective cold dread settled over the city's financial district. The public suddenly realized that the men who gambled away a copper fortune were the same men who managed their savings. The whisper began: if the Hineses fail, so does the Knickerbocker. On the morning of Tuesday, October 22nd, a crowd began to form outside the magnificent, colonnaded headquarters of the Knickerbocker Trust Company. At first, it was just a nervous trickle of depositors. Within hours, it had swelled into a full-blown mob, a serpentine, desperate queue stretching for blocks. This was the dreaded phenomenon known as a bank run. People wanted their cash, and they wanted it now. The Knickerbocker had $8 million in cash reserves, a huge sum by any measure, but it was nothing compared to the demands of thousands of terrified citizens. The officers tried to remain calm, paying out the cash in a slow, agonizing stream. But the speed of the panic was faster than their tellers could count. At 11:30 a.m., the Knickerbocker Trust Company, unable to meet the demands of its own customers, was forced to close its doors. A roar of shock and despair went up from the desperate crowd. The panic had now crossed the invisible, deadly line. The failure of the Knickerbocker was the financial equivalent of an airborne infection. Depositors at every other major trust company and bank in the city, seeing a pillar of finance crumble, rushed to pull out their money. The entire financial mechanism of the world's fastest-growing economy was seized by terror. The age of the Titans had begun. Chapter 2. The Olympian God of Finance. Across town, at number 23 Wall Street, stood the austere, fortress-like headquarters of J.P. Morgan & Co.
The building itself was a metaphor for the man who ran it, solid, unadorned, and immovable. John Pierpont Morgan was 70 years old, but his power was at its zenith. He was not merely a banker, he was an economic sovereign. He had organized the American railroad system, merged Carnegie Steel into U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, and was the single most dominating figure in American finance. His physical appearance was as intimidating as his reputation. A huge, thick-set man, he possessed piercing dark eyes and a massive, bulbous, famously afflicted nose that always drew attention, which he ignored with regal disdain. He was the only man in America who could reliably command the attention of the world's most skeptical capitalists. Morgan had been away, attending a church convention in Richmond, Virginia, when the Knickerbocker failed. A furious, urgent telegram brought him racing back to New York on his private train, the Great Northern. He arrived to find a city in chaos. Stock prices were plummeting, credit markets had seized up, and every bank in the city was on the verge of suspending payment. The fear was real. If the panic spread to the New York banks and then across the nation, the entire economy, factories, railroads, farms, would grind to a complete halt. There would be mass unemployment, civil unrest, and perhaps the actual collapse of the Republican experiment. Morgan took immediate and decisive control, acting as the private central banker that the government had failed to create. He didn't ask for permission from President Theodore Roosevelt. He didn't ask for a vote from Congress. He simply dictated the terms of the nation's survival. His first move was to send his emissaries, Frank A. Vanderlip of the National City Bank and Benjamin Strong of Bankers Trust, to survey the damage. They returned with the grim news: the Union Trust Company, another behemoth, was next. On the evening of Wednesday, October 23rd, the most important meeting in American financial history was called, not in a government building, but in Morgan's opulent library on East 36th Street. It was a room designed to intimidate, lined floor to ceiling with rare books and priceless artwork, giving the gathering a funereal gravitas. The greatest bankers of New York, men who usually guarded their reserves like dragons, were summoned and compelled to attend. Morgan did not ask them to contribute to a bailout fund. He simply told them what their contribution would be. He laid out the dire facts. The panic was bigger than any single bank, and only their collective, coordinated action, with his guidance, could stop it. There must be no hesitation, Morgan declared, his voice a low, gravelly command that brooked no dissent. You will provide the money, and I will direct its use. The bankers, terrified of the public exposure and convinced that their own institutions would be dragged down with the rest, were slow to agree. The silence in the magnificent room was broken only by the scratching of Morgan's own pencil as he made his own calculations on a small notepad. The fate of the entire American economy rested on whether these competing, selfish oligarchs would agree to act as one. The night was long, the stakes were absolute, and the battle to save capitalism had